if you don't.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. I'm just gonna. I'm just getting my timer up. Three, two, one. Speaker, chivalry normalizes a power imbalance between men and women. It furthers the narrative of paternalism, and most importantly, it makes the whole idea of the nice guy behavior acceptable and makes it hereby much worse. What we will do on our side of the house is we are going to politely have feminists encourage women to politely and respectfully turn down these things like opening a door and those sort of things in a polite way, which is assertive and shows them that's not what I like, but I still respect you as an individual. What we also want to know is that this is a uniquely Western norm, largely coming from the UK and is prevalent from those sort of ideas. And as such, we believe this debate largely takes place in the Western world instead of in developing countries. I'm going to also outline what the goals of the feminist movement are and why we align with those. We believe that the feminist movement is unique in the way that it provides women with a voice, and it is the only movement to provide women with that voice. And furthermore, we believe the feminist movement's overall goal is to provide progressive, radical change because it is the only movement which can achieve this change. This looks like getting more abortion rights. This looks like having the Me Too movement and calling out abuses and stuff like that. But most importantly, it looks like getting radical change for women to help women. This means that this is an incredibly important part of the debate, and the feminist movement should be advocating for radical change if it can improve the lives of women. I'm going to show you in my speech two things. One, how we improve the lives of women, and two, how we get better men actors and better allies overall. First, I'm going to identify the actors who are going to change with this in the introduction of this policy. We believe that there are two key groups which are likely to change as a result of this policy getting introduced. And they are the two ones. One, men who think that this is honestly just a respectful thing and they don't realize that it's condescending and kind of a bit off. And two, the guys who believe that they are nice guys will tell everyone they're a nice guy and as a result think that they're entitled to behave that way, basically to get in with the girl. So I'm going to first address those who believe So I'm going to first address how this becomes a norm and how individuals think that this is the way they should act in relation to the idea of the first group, which is people who genuinely just believe this is a respectful thing to do and something that women appreciate. So the way this gets started is threefold. Firstly, the way they are exposed to this happening and the way that their perception changes is threefold. Firstly, they get a polite refusal from a woman. So a woman says something like, the guy opens a door for her and she says, oh, no, thank you, I can open the door myself. Now, that's not rude. That's not in any way rude, but what it does to that guy is it signals, okay, this random woman or this woman I kind of know does not need my help simply by product of me being a man in something she obviously doesn't need my help with, and I don't need to assert that power imbalance. The second way they can find out about it is like through media sources. So the media are explaining to them either in a letter or an article or something like that, that women don't appreciate these relatively condescending acts, which are very, very different to being nice. Going and buying a friend a coffee or something like that as a friend is very, very different to holding a door open or saying something like ladies first, which what it does is it says, I am only treating you like this because of your gender, because I think you need it. That needs to be understood. Very different to being nice, to being simply, whatever the word is. The third thing is having female friends explaining to men why this is something which shouldn't be explained, having female friends. This looks like a woman explaining to another guy, oh, the reason the girl didn't want you to pay for her meal when you went out on a date with her is simply because she's an independent, autonomous woman and doesn't want that or need that and views this relationship as an equal thing rather than something where you had to pay her money and stuff like that. That's the third group. So we think that people are going to get exposure to this in a very relatively nice way, where it's more an informative way to understand it rather than a massive attack on them as to who they are. So now how are these groups going to change as a result of this? Firstly, we think that there are going to be two key reasons why this occurs. Why are these groups going to change? Firstly, there's a lack of identification for what women actually want. So men think that by doing this, they're doing what women want, when in fact it obviously isn't. This means that there's a lack of messaging, as I've already shown, happens in the media, with the media growing up watching movies where that's how the guy gets in with the girl. They do something like that, and the guy thinks, okay, so I hold a door open for a woman, then she'll sleep with me. That's more or less the imaging that we get. And what this does is this happens in such a way that you don't question it and you assume that is how you were meant to act. We are able to change that narrative on our side and able to show and have genuine conversations with women about why that maybe is not the case. So what this means is that the narrative changes and that these men actually begin to understand why women do not like this behavior, and B, begin to change their behavior as a result of it. So what happens when acts are declined by these? So what we want to change the idea of is that not the only framework of respect is this. We want women to be seen as individuals, autonomous from guys, and able to do this. As a result, there shouldn't be the only framework that to respect a woman you have to hold the door open or something like that. Rather, it should be the idea that maybe another form of respect is listening to the woman, not playing her down and talking over her and stuff like that. So changing the norm of what is actually important. We believe this is really important for two things. One, because it's important to women, and we know women actually care about being respected and listened to, which does not come through someone opening a door. And two is because that men begin to realize that women are able to look after themselves. Women do not need protection, rather they need equal and mutual respect. So the outcome of this is that men's views around women and around what women should be changes drastically. They don't view women as someone who should be protected necessarily, but rather an individual who is equal. This is also very important because it helps intersectionality in the regards to more masculine women are more respected, as well as trans women, etc. Because we don't have this strong view of what a woman should be and all this hyper femininity. So the outcome of this is that it allows acknowledgement of an imbalance in power, and it allows this to be fixed by men. So we believe this is very, very important because it does benefit the experience of women, which is an important stakeholder in this debate as the feminist movement. The second group we're going to identify is the nice guy group. Now, ultimately, this group basically will tell everyone they're a nice guy, wants to sleep with a woman. We think that's more or less basically what this group does. We think that when this person gets rejected by a woman, there's going to be four outcomes. The first is the refusal to give them a sense of entitlement, because the guy does something and they think, okay, I now deserve to be able to sleep you, touch you, grope you, or something like that. That looks like going into a nightclub, the guy holding the door for you, and then thinking, okay, I can now either make out with you, fuck you, or sleep, or grope you, or something like that. That is what it looks like. When you refuse it, you are able to get rid of that guy who, because he's like this, and more or less that's the reason he's doing it, you don't have to deal with him. The second group is that we believe that some of these people are going to get mad at you for doing this. We think that's a really good thing that you're able to identify it the moment it happens. Because if they're going to get mad that you turn down some chivalrous act, that means one, they believe in very strong patriarchal values. Two, they're likely to be a very toxic and abusive person. And three, you're able to identify that the moment it happens instead of talking to them for half an hour, finding out later when you're halfway to their house that they're an abusive person. Those sort of things is why it's really important. You're able to identify it, get away from them immediately. The third is empowering women who tell them to fuck off, more or less. This is a really great thing to do, and I'm sure any women in the room will know that being able to tell a nice guy who thinks that they're entitled to you to go fuck themselves is the most powerful thing you've ever done, and it just feels great. The fourth is to the extent that these guys actually want to get laid, there's a good chance they're going to change their behavior when they realize it doesn't work, and as a result going to treat women better. So the overall impact we brought to you on our side of the debate is that women get treated a lot better. We get a mutual respect for women rather than a simple pathetic chivalrous behavior, and men begin to treat women better as a result of it too. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech, leader. Opt, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. Here.
like the analysis that they give you about why an incel who literally thinks of a woman as a sex toy is going to suddenly have like a kind of life-changing worldview, like life-changing experience when a woman tells him no. We know for a fact that men like this do not respect the word no. It is incredible. What they brought you is like a few kind of nice sentiments about how men are suddenly going to change their minds. We don't think that it's that simple. All this model is going to do is further alienate men, further like push them away from the feminist movement, and make the change that they wanted to occur so much harder to come by. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, some setup, then some rebuttal, and to one of their points. I'll integrate the rest throughout. Then why we better achieve the aims of the feminist movement under our side of the house. And finally, why women just deserve to be treated nicely. So firstly, in setup, what does chivalry look like? We think that they kind of agree with us here in that this isn't just like a guy being nice. This is a guy being nice to a woman because she is a woman and nothing else. We'd also note though that the same kind of like idea that you should be nice to women because they are women probably is also coupled with this perception that women need protection, which I'll like touch on later, but we would note that this is coming from a place of like, a lot of the time there is also this kind of like protective dimension to it. So the second point of setup is also kind of my point of rebuttal, right? Which is, what does its rejection look like? So they tell you that women can just politely say no, and that's probably enough, but we don't think it's anywhere near that simple, right? We think that like if someone holds a door open for you and you say like, no thanks, I can open a door myself, you'll probably be questioned as to why you are saying no, given that it is a very simple gesture. A lot of the time, they're not just going to step back and say like, oh, okay, never mind, thank you, especially by their own characterization. If these men are people who like think of women as like lesser than, they're probably going to be like, wait, what's the problem? Like, I'm just holding a door open for you. Why don't you appreciate it? Are you one of those like bra burning feminists? Right? They're probably going to get angry. Note again, these like men are pretty bad at like accepting the idea that women have like autonomy and can say no. There will be questioning. We also note that like this is obviously going to be tied to the feminist movement to some extent. They told you that there would be like media attention about it. So we think that like, not only are these women going to be questioned for the fact that they are saying no, they're also going to, like the men who are having the chivalry rejected are going to associate that rejection with feminism because it is the feminist movement that is telling these women to do these things. They can't hide from that. So we think that like, which is just an important piece of setup. We also would note in rebuttal here that the messaging that they refer to already exists. There are already countless second wave feminists who are very outspoken saying that we don't want your help, but men do not like agree with this. They do not care, right? The problem is that men don't care, and they're not going to care if they feel like they are under attack by these movements. What we think we would rather, onto this next point as to why we better achieve the aims of the feminist movement. So what is the aim of the feminist movement? We think it is fundamentally to achieve justice for women, and the best mechanism to make this change is to like make the cause amenable to the public. Note that if you are like trying to change things in systems of power, you have to appeal to the powerful. In this case, the powerful are men, and if men feel alienated and isolated by your cause, they're going to like perceive you as like man-hating, bra-burning bitches. It makes men a lot less likely to be sympathetic, right? And we care. These are specifically stakeholders that we care about being sympathetic because they are the ones in power. We think that if people, like, for example, hate feminists in Australia, there is a lot less support for a feminist kind of action, like implementing a quota for women in parliament. That would be a change that would make a very big difference to the feminist movement. But because the name of feminism is like smeared, we think that it is less likely that is going to be supported by the general public. We think the best way to achieve the support of the general public is inclusivity and not alienating anyone. So why does rejecting chivalry uniquely alienate men? I've already told you that this rejection is explicitly tied to feminism. So let's look at who is actually offering these acts of chivalry. We note that we have the same kind of stakeholder ID as the opposition. So 2 main groups of people. The first of which is like incels. Let's not beat around the bush here. They probably already hate feminists, and being rejected by a woman like in doing something as simple as opening a door is probably only going to further justify their cause. I've already told you, like, if these men think of women as glorified sex toys, they are not going to respect their autonomy. They're not going to have a complete like change of mind. They're just going to go to Reddit and complain about like how much they hate women, about how women are like only want guys who like treat them like shit. This is only going to further entrench their like like already shitty beliefs. The second group of people are people who have like traditional values, who maybe don't hate women, but just think that they deserve to be treated differently to men, right? And we think that if their perceived kindness is rejected, it makes them a lot less sympathetic towards women, because if they were just trying to do a nice thing and a woman says, no, I can do it myself, it does come across as very condescending. It does come across as very kind of like, ew, no, I don't want your help. And a lot of these men, if they are just trying to do something like out of the goodness of their heart, it makes them less inclined to want to be good towards women, right? It alienates them, and we see that we don't get their support from it, like in terms of feminist policy, which we think is a bad thing. But secondly, it also radicalizes these men who are like, right now their intentions are good, but the more they are rejected by women, the more they are like likely to become incels. We think any world in which there is less incels is probably a better world. On the comparative, we probably get less incels, whereas they like create them. So at the end of this, we think it is important to note the aims of the feminist movement are change. Change does not occur when half of the population hates you. So onto this final, like last point, which is like why women deserve to be treated nicely. A principle and a practical point under this. In principle, we think that the world just kind of sucks for women, right? Like to the extent that any act of kindness is probably good, any act of kindness is probably reparations that women are owed. You know, if I'm in a club and a man like offers to buy me a drink, even if he is only buying me a drink because he wants to sleep with me later, fuck it, I get a free drink. And like, I could use one of them, right? The world in which women exist is not a world that treats them nicely. We think that like any act of kindness, something as simple as holding open a door, if it makes a woman's day better, we'd probably back it. We would note that like, I would also note that the characterization we offer and the characterization that they kind of also back means that like these actors would not otherwise be nice to women, right? In that if they're only offering these acts of chivalry because they think women need it and women say, oh no, we don't actually need like any sort of kindness, they're probably not going to be nice to women in any meaningful extent, which means that we get women being treated nicely less. We think that is a principal harm. But on the practical side of this, we think that there are very important situations where chivalry looks like protecting women, right? We think that what we've seen in Parliament lately, and like also like all over the world, is that when men don't confront each other on like things like toxic masculinity, on harassing women, on inappropriate treatment of women, then the really bad cultures are able to foster. Women get hurt when men don't call each other out on their bullshit. We think that in a world where if a woman is being harassed and you're a kind of person who thinks of that woman as a damsel in distress, you're much more likely to help her. She may not be a damsel in distress, but she is in fact in distress, and your like intervention could save her life, right? In comparison, if you think that like women aren't like all women, like if you step in and intervene when a guy at a club is kind of like touching her and you can tell she doesn't want it, if you think she's going to turn around and say, fuck you, I can speak for myself, you're less likely to step in. And at the point at which you are not likely to step in when a woman is literally being harassed, like we know how dangerous it is when men are complicit in the harassment or don't confront toxic masculinity. We don't care about their motivation of intervening in these cases if it keeps women safe. Under our side of the house, we protect women, we serve the aims of the feminist movement. So proud to negate.
Thank you for that excellent speech. Second F, the floor is yours when you're ready. Here.
Am I audible?
Loud and clear.
The difference between the affirmatives world and the negatives counterfactual is this: that when you say no in the bar, when you were offered a drink, finally, when someone approaches you in the bar and they buy you a drink and subsequently they think they're entitled to your body and you say no, there is a world in which people won't blame you for leading them on. The victim blaming culture that is stemmed in rape culture happens when, at a point in which you are a recipient of that act of chivalry, it means that you've given males license to make moves on you. That is the reason why there was a huge difference on our side. Don't let them say that there's no change on our side when it comes to the interactions between male and females. I think it's quite clear how exactly these norms interact subsequently in how society, for example, governs those interactions. So now people are not going to look at the woman who said yes to the drink but no to having sex later as being someone that led them on, but just simply someone like they're not going to do that ever, because like on our side you reject that act of chivalry anyway. But more importantly, I want to be very clear on what are the ways in which women are currently oppressed. I have 5 main things I want to discuss here. But first, I want to quickly like take out some other stuff that they say. They say that right now, there is no harm to saying no to men. If you say no to a man opening up a door for you or like doing chivalrous acts for you, there's no harm in doing that. There's no harm in saying no. That's just wrong. If you think about it, what often happens in a majority of cases is that a lot of these men will end up being like, why are you rejecting me? They feel very slighted. They feel like, oh, why? Are you a lesbian? Why don't you want to be a recipient of my chivalrous actions? The problem with that being that it is fundamentally disgusting for men to hide under their comfortable duvets and be like, don't alienate me. This is oppression for men. Now women aren't taking in any of like my goodwill and chivalrous acts. Presumably it is far more oppressive in terms of scale of oppression when it comes to saying that they must be willing to accept and receive chivalrous acts all the time. I presume that the opposition has to agree with us that it is gross for men to think that they can play women up like a cello or play women up like a machine that has a formula for succeeding in the interaction with the woman via chivalry, especially when that chivalry is incredibly oppressive in a large majority of instances and is based off a purported fundamental truth that society thinks about when it comes to women, that women are weak. Women should stay under the ambit of male protection. Maybe they wouldn't have gotten raped if they got a guy to follow them back home, when actually in general, men shouldn't be trusted. That generally is the problem, I think. And that's the reason why I'm going to explain to you the 5 key ways in which men currently use this as a tool of oppression towards women. And obviously, this responds to a lot of things that they've said so far in their speech, in the next speech. First, I want to just discuss generally like what this looks like in terms of how it leads to consent issues. I've already covered a bit of this in response, right? When I talked to you about how rejection basically leads to you currently being seen as, someone that's trying to take advantage of men. I want to be very clear about this. We think right now that there's a huge problem with consent when it comes to the interactions between male and females. The problem right now here is acts of chivalry give men the impression that they have the license to, for example, pursue interactions with you in a way that is perhaps more romantic. For example, in the case of buying a drink at the bar, that becomes something that is easily weaponized against you. But the second thing here that I want to talk about is that it is fundamentally objectifying and oppressive to suggest that women should all be able to should be made happy via these things. Like the fundamental assumptions in society right now look like acts of chivalry are what makes a gentleman, and that a gentleman is able to please a woman. That very simplistic, formulaic way of thinking about women is oppressive for the very fact that it is formulaic. It treats women like robots that are able to basically accept input from men and then give output in terms of emotional reciprocation. That is fundamentally disgusting. There is no playbook for how, for example, a man should go in there and please and try to please a woman and play her up like a cello. That is presumably a lot more objectifying on their side in the comparative. That's the reason why we think that the feminist movement need to encourage the rejection of acts of chivalry at a point at which it is purported to be the way in which you want to, the formula to get to the hearts of women, when often it is used by bad faith actors as a fundamental precursor to all the subsequent interactions that become harassy on their side. So if their point was harassment, I would say the harassment occurs in much greater scale at a point at which men believe that acts of chivalry are the only way for you to, for example, be good show your goodwill to women and subsequently get license, for example, for subsequent interactions. That's just fundamentally disgusting. And I think the important thing to note here is that this is incredibly dehumanizing. So if they want to argue about sexual objectification on their side, I don't think that's something that they win on. But more importantly, their argument or their response to our case here was, this has a protective dimension to it. It is not like terrible. Here's the thing. I'm going to engage a little bit with the developing world context as well, because I think that's just something that we should do in most debates. But more importantly, what I want to point out here is this, that saying that there's a protective dimension to this doesn't mean that it negates all the other harms of sexism that I've just talked to you about. But more importantly, if you look in like countries like India, the Gulabi gang is an extra vigilante group that literally goes and hunts the shit out of these men who abuse their wives, who cheated on their wives, or who did or domestically abuse their wives. I'm pretty sure in these particular instances, when we say leave it to the men to govern themselves, at a point in which you have the norm of chivalry being interacted with society, there's a high threshold for men to take action against other men, because obviously a lot of men think that, oh, but it's normal, what, right? It's probably like she shouldn't have accepted the drink at the bar. But at a point in which like the Gulabi gang goes out there and does all the whacking needed for all these women, obviously that's a good thing. They beat up the men and shit like that. That's awesome. I think in that particular instance, it is far better for them to be protective of themselves, for women to be protective of themselves, and to obviously draw the line in the sand for when is it appropriate for men, and obviously when should we take back power from men, and when should we like take action against men. I think that's something that we get uniquely in the developing world context, if this was ever a context in the debate. But the last thing I want to do is go back to this entire like 3 ways that this is oppressive, right? So I've proven to you how in 2 ways it's oppressive. The 3 ways now include this. Like, if the argument that they have here is that, you know, men are going to be so offended by this, that's male fragility that they're talking about here. I think that's an infinitely elastic problem, right, on their side. On their side, their claim here is this, but like, you can't alienate men, that's bad. The path to victory often requires men who are the oppressors to feel incredibly uncomfortable. I don't know how infinitely elastic their argument is here, because if it is true that we shouldn't alienate men, probably we shouldn't have Me Too and we hashtag Me Too and cancel culture on their side. I just don't think that's something that's particularly important, and I don't think it's strategic for them to defend that stance as well. The 4th way this is oppressive is that this often results in them having to conform and acquiesce to what it means for men to decide as to how they should be respected. That is a form of sexism in itself. The last thing I want to point out here is that this is very, very exclusionary towards trans and non-conforming women. So like, if you're a trans woman, you'll never be on the receiving end of these things. As a non-conforming individual, you will never be recipient of these particular acts, because fundamentally, even if you are, you're more likely to be subject to a hate crime, because if you're a female passing trans woman, you're far more likely to get hated on and beaten up because of men who have internalized transphobia, who now think they've opened the door for a fake woman purportedly. We think that's horrible. That's the reasons why we are proud to affirm the motion.
Thank you for that fine speech. Second leg, the floor is now yours. Here.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Let's get things straight, panel. When the goal of the feminist cause is to create a better world for women, the affirmative model becomes incongruent with this. Because we didn't think that men were going to take no for an answer. We thought that rejecting a drink at a bar was not something that men were going to take as a learning experience, but we thought it was something that they weren't necessarily going to take well. And we think that the absolute mistake here is not to say that we care if men are offended. It's the fact that when men are offended, it weaponizes the feminist movement. It reinforces misogynistic ideas, which leads to more unsafe situations for women. It means and we think that this puts worse women in worse situations at the end of the day. And we think in the best case, what the affirmative team is able to prove that instead of these misogynistic actions coming from a condescending place, what's going to happen is it's going to come from a place of anger and resentment, and this is fundamentally going to manifest in worse outcomes. So what am I going to do in today's speech? I spend essentially two things. First, I'm going to talk to you why the affirmative team model is not congruent with like the feminist movement. And secondly, looking at like, what does rejection actually look like and will this lead to tangible change? So on this first idea of the feminist movement. So the affirmative team essentially told us two things. The first thing they wanted to tell us is that their main metric for measuring the success of this model is whether this will be able to provide radical change. This is what we heard at First Affirmative. Panel, the metric provided by the opposition never matched their outcome. We told you at first, like, we have two responses to this. What we told you first was that in order to actually enact change, you need to impact the people in power. Who were these people in power? We think largely the people in power are like these old white men. And we think, as we told you at first, this is not something that men are going to take well. We think men who are conservative, who's grown up with these ideals, are not going to be like suddenly accept these ideas, especially since it's so entrenched. We think that these people in power are not going to accept this, and we don't think we're going to see these going to make things harder to change fundamentally. The second thing to say is that we thought that like we were going to see like it will reduce sort of like political capital for the feminist movement as a whole, in terms of rather than looking at for like tangible and enacting change, more focus we put on like these sort of things. We thought the impact of this was fundamentally it was alienating the people in power, and we weren't going to see any sort of like we're going to see less radical change, contrary to what the affirmative team wanted to tell us. The second thing I wanted to say was essentially that their model was going to, it no longer normalizes the power imbalance and sort of like brings down the patriarchy like that. What we say is that this like power imbalance is not going anywhere, because what we thought is when we alienate men, you make a bigger gap between the genders. You're like separating them further apart. And what we think this does is it reinforces the patriarchy. When we make this bigger separation, when we like have this sort of like model that like alienates and no longer has men within the feminist movement, it reinforces the patriarchy and reinforces these like old-fashioned ideals. The third thing that we want to say here is that fundamentally, what the messaging from the affirmative team is that it is fundamentally can be blaming women for their own oppression, in the idea that like if the messaging coming from the feminist movement is that like it's on the women to like be saying no and rejecting this, we don't think it's an appropriate message to be saying that like, oh, you should have just said no, this is what you should have done, because fundamentally it shouldn't be on the woman that like they are being harassed by a man, and we don't think that this is positive messaging coming from the feminist movement. So moving on to the second question here of like, what does this rejection actually lead to? And we thought that like, there were two questions under here. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is like, what's the immediate reaction going to look like after this rejection? And the second question here is like, what do we think this is going to lead to? Is this going to lead to better like behavior down the line and support for feminism? So on this first question of like, what is the sort of immediate impact? So we heard two things from the affirmative team. The first thing that we heard was essentially, well, what it's going to mean is like men are going to learn that like women don't need this sort of help. They don't need like help opening the doors. They don't need us like men to buy drinks. We thought that like this probably wasn't quite true, because we thought like men knew that women can open doors. We think that they never thought of this as like a physical impediment. It was more coming from a place of like, oh, like there was no genuine need. It was more sort of like their version of respect. So like we didn't think that this was like a very like valid change. So we thought that like the better sort of substantive came in the second idea, in terms of like why men will no longer why men will learn that this is like a condescending act and not welcome by women, because like it's something that's informative if it's like communicated in a nice way. Panel, the manner in which rejection is communicated doesn't matter, because men are shit and they do not take rejection well. Even if like a woman is incredibly nice in the way that they communicate rejection, we don't think men are going to take this well. We have three responses to this. The first thing to say, like I said, men aren't going to accept no for an answer. We think that like when men perceive what they're doing as something is kind, when it's perceived kindness and someone's rejecting that, you're not going to suddenly like take that super well, because fundamentally they think that they are doing a good thing. We think that like what this is going to lead to is that this sort of like perceived kindness is going to be channeled into anger, which is fundamental, and resentment, which is fundamentally more harmful. The second sort of response to this is we thought that this was going to lead to more dangerous situation for women to be in. We think that if you're in a club and like it's like a drunk guy's trying to buy you a drink and you are rejecting him, we think that like time and time again we see that like men do not take this well. We think that this is going to open up women like to one, more uncomfortable situations which can be fundamentally traumatic, and two, even more extreme like cases of like sexual assault and rape when they're being opened up to these dangerous situations. What the affirmative team tried to tell us here that like was when women say yes, they are to like drinks and like opening the door, they're allowing themselves to be taken advantage of. what we think actually what happens in the status quo is like women have been able to sort of like work out mechanisms to keep themselves safe. And these sort of look like things of like in the club being like, sorry, my boyfriend's in the bathroom, you can't buy you don't need to buy me that drink. And we thought that like that was fundamentally, there was mechanisms in the status quo, defense mechanisms, which were far safer than fundamentally rejecting men. The third thing to say was that like they wanted to tell us that media would be a really good voice for this. Fundamentally, we didn't agree with this because media is inherently conservative, run by like all white men, and we thought that we were going to have men like Andrew Ball who were going to be peddling the idea that this is like an attack on men as a whole, and we didn't think that the media was going to be a friendly voice here. So moving on to the second question under this clash of like, will this at the end of the day lead to better behavior and like more feminist support? Fundamentally, what we say on this side of the house is that this will lead to like the an association with the feminist causes, so rejection, and men will fundamentally feel attacked by feminism. What has the affirmative team tried to tell us? They told us firstly that like this model will change the way that men will want to respect women rather than like acts of chivalry. It'll be like better things. Two responses. Firstly, they never provided a metric of why this behavior will change. Like there was no reason why suddenly men would channel their sort of ideas into like acting in a different way. The second thing to say is we thought that when men were rejected, they were less likely to sort of pursue and be like, I really want to respect women. We thought it was more likely to manifest in things like anger. We thought that like the second thing they wanted to tell us was that like they will be able to change the views of misogynists. We did not think that incels who only viewed women as like sex toys were going to suddenly be like a wonderful feminist ally because women are rejecting them opening doors for them. Unlike what the affirmative team said, we don't care if their feelings are hurt. We think that what happens with like, what this does is it weaponizes the feminist movement in many ways, and it justifies their hateful comments. We think we think that what these misogynists do, they kill women, they rape women, and we don't want to sort of like justify this. And the best case from the affirmative team, what they are able to prove that maybe some men might be like less condescending, but at the end of the day, what they are allowing is they are justifying misogynistic views, they're justifying hateful views, which fundamentally at the end of the day have worse outcomes and is not justifiable. The third thing that I wanted to tell us today was this idea of like how like it would be better for like trans women and also like non-binary women because it'll shift the idea of femininity. We didn't agree with this because we thought it was sort of shifting the idea of like feminism rather than femininity, and we didn't think this change was going to occur, which is why at the end of the speech we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Third F, the floor is yours when you're ready. Here.
Give me 1 second to get my papers. All right, can I be heard?
Yep, loud and clear.
The reason why this team cannot win this debate is because they've refused time and time again to engage with where this debate actually lay. Because both teams agreed at first that chivalry was inextricably linked with respect, and it was used either as a way of showing respect or as a way of signaling respect artificially. That means then that this debate existed in people who acted with those incentives and therefore were susceptible to changes around the norm to do with chivalry. That means then that this claim from negative team that men won't change broadly is incredibly unnuanced because they do not consider individual groups of men and the way that they behave. 3 responses to the claim that men won't change. The first thing to note is that it is definitely true that a lot of men won't. But the alternative for those men who did not act out of respect for women or wanting to show respect for women were those that still did not engage with the movement in their world either. And in terms of political change, that was broadly a wash. Secondly, they were like the people that we told you did engage with women out of chivalry was people who wanted to respect women and thought that this was the way to do so. And these were people who predominantly lay in the progressive sector. And thirdly, for those that didn't engage, we said, fuck them, because it was much more important to empower women. The feminist movement went and did Me Too, and that caused a lot of backlash, and we are all the better for it now because individual women on the ground are better off. The first thing I want to do in this debate is mention the material that Joel gave you at second affirmative that got absolutely no response, which I think was really harmful for this team's case. For the reason that I think it's debate winning alone. The claim that we told you was that we have women who are currently excluded from the movement engaged now. This looked like trans women and this looked like not people who did not conform. In the dying moments of the second neg speech, they respond and they tell us, but these people wouldn't engage anyway because the feminine movement is exclusionary. That is correct. It is exclusionary along the vector of non-feminine behavior. And these were the people who exhibited behavior that wasn't strictly feminine. So when you normalize that it was okay for women to not fit into conventional norms of femininity insofar as rejecting chivalry or condescension from men, you made it such that these people did not self-preclude themselves from engaging with this movement. The reason why this claim was devastating for this negative team was because this was a group of people that was uniquely voiceless and uniquely needed representation. And I think that is alone in this debate to get us over the line. Cool. Let's then engage with where this team wanted to rest their case, which was to do with the way that men behaved and I guess like getting political change from them. I would note firstly at the start of this that the majority of political change, particularly within the feminist movement, happens from the left wing. That is to say that the conservative wings in various countries do not improvements to the quality of women's lives. These are the restrictions upon those things in the first place. The first group then is to identify dudes who think that this is how you respect women and are consequently chivalrous. We told you that these were people who like inner city left-wing white guys, right? Who were exposed from childhood to movies where they saw that this was the mode of respecting women. The way their parents engaged was through these norms. And they had no alternative frameworks to rely on insofar as respect. And when they went out, when they spoke to their female friends, when they went on dates on Tinder, they wanted to be kind to them because they thought it was good to respect women and thought that this was the way in which you respected women because of a lack of any other narrative. What this then meant was that any policy pushed from the left, particularly with regard to feminism, was pushed for political change that perpetuated these norms or did not recognize existing power imbalances. What happened then when these people experienced rejection? This team tells us they will be really mad and get completely alienate themselves from the movement. I think the point at which they already act with their respect for women and they are being chivalrous means that to some extent they're inelastic in that they will probably continue to engage with the movement to some degree. That then means that, so this debate is then more about how they engage with the movement. Two things. We firstly told you that this made them identify paternalistic and power imbalance behaviors, which is to say that the way this looked like was you being rejected and you being like, shit, I thought I was being a nice guy, and asking perhaps a female friend about it, or maybe reading an article on it, or watching a movie in which this was a norm that was represented, and the woman telling her friend that, it was really bad that this man was being condescending to her. And then recognizing that the reason why that woman didn't want that was because it in and of itself was not respectful for her. That meant men were much more conscious of their actions when they were wanting to be kind to women in such a way that meant that these were people that were less likely to commit things like microaggressions. These were men that were more likely to call out other men who acted along these lines for the reason that they saw it as bad now. And they were more likely to be better allies and closer allies in the longer term. That was a huge benefit in this debate because these were the only people that really gave a shit about women in the first place and would support the feminist movement. And that was the most important group in the debate. And that was why we won on this. Winning on this issue wins us this debate by a fairly large margin. The second thing we told you was that this redefined what respect constituted for a lot of people on the left wing, particularly men. Because when they saw what a woman actually wanted, as opposed to what was shown in films, it exposes them to the concept that, wait a minute, you mean chivalry isn't respect in and of itself? And it means that you start to think more about what constitutes respect in a general sense. The impact of that was very important because it meant that upon introspection, noting again that this was a group of people who did actually care about women, these were people who were then able to change. They were able to change the way they acted, but also they changed the norms of the feminist movement broadly from the left wing. Because we both conceded that men have a large amount of political capital in the world. Exactly. And to the extent to which we change men on the left wing, we win this debate because we were able to make them push for changes to norms of protection. That it wasn't okay to say that, why did she walk home alone? These kinds of things became far more problematic when men were able to recognize that on the left. And it also made them far more able to accept masculine or non-feminist behaviors. They tell us two things. Firstly, that men who are traditional are pushed away from the movement. I think The first thing to note here is that these traditional people are unlikely to be very useful allies or allies in the first place. Like their alternative mechanism is completely non-existent in this debate. Secondly, I would flip this claim and say that to the extent to which you change the way that they perceive respect to some degree, not to the same degree as you would with like left-wing people who actually want to engage, I think you feed into the narrative of like, oh, people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps in such a way that probably makes them respect women more, even if you don't buy this flip, which I think is actually quite legitimate. Like the flip is good, is what I mean. You have to, like, this muddies the waters on this claims completely. But thirdly, like weigh this against the like much better allies that we get on the left from men, and also just more women engaging with this movement. And this claim falls out. These were people that were like not particularly important in the round. The second response is to say, there will be more violence towards women now. Again, the people that were likely to commit these acts of violence are probably going to do so either way. The delta in our case was that you were able to identify these people as problematic earlier when you exposed them to rejection and you saw their behavior. And that was the reason why we won on that group as well. Very briefly then on nice guys, because this team like talks so much about this group of people, but they don't recognize that like, maybe like incels who like, talk about how they don't fuck and that's like women's fault, aren't going to be allies or engage with the movement in any progressive way ever. So it's unclear what the delta is on their side. I think the best interpretation of this case is that maybe they become like more angry, but I would note that the end point of a rejection is the same thing, right? Like if you buy a woman a drink, then like, you still don't get to fuck her at the end of the day. Whereas you find out earlier now, maybe you're grateful for that. Maybe you are like more respectful to women. So the second thing to note is that, maybe you are able to convince a small section of incels to reconsider the way that they act. I think that is quite tenuous though. But the benefit that we gave you was that we allowed women to tell these people to fuck off. We were able to allow women to refuse them a sense of entitlement that allowed them to grope them in nightclubs, that allowed them to follow them home to try and fuck them, etc., in a way that was incredibly empowering. Weigh the group of feminist incels against the radical increase in empowerment, as well as like, I guess pickup strategies now are more progressive, which is probably a good thing and like better achieves their principle. This team does not engage with where this debate lies. They straw man us and they lose.
Thank you for that fine speech. That negative, the floor is yours when you're ready. Here.
When incels face rejection, they want to kill women. Time and time again on news, we hear stories of men taking rejection badly and harming women. That is why currently women often do accept chivalrous acts, even if they feel condescended to, because doing so otherwise would open them up to a big risk. That is a harm that this opposition must deal with, and that is a harm that in and of itself gets us ahead in this debate. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to look at what does this messaging look like? And secondly, I'm going to look at how men will act. Within that question, I'm going to look at the different types of men that have been identified in this debate. Let's turn to the first issue. The first claim we get from this opposition is that this messaging will look like polite and respectful. The first thing to note is even if it was done in a polite and respectful way, as we tell you, men do this out of feeling nice. You do not open a door for a woman because you think she's physically incapable of doing it. You probably do it because you think by doing it, she will respond in a nice way. That is the exact reason that when you are rejected, you are likely to react not in a positive way, because when you do something nice and rejected, you feel hurt. But the second thing to say is it wasn't just that person that was rejecting you. You necessarily associated with feminism, which is obviously true, given that opposition says that it will be talked about in the media and women will talk about it. And that is an important fact that will be discussed later on. But the third thing to say is as First Affirmative tells you,
that often it will look like people saying fuck off. We think that probably in many instances it isn't in a politeful and respectful way, and it probably looks like in a particularly acrimonious manner that heightens the extent to which men would perceive this badly and would be further disenfranchised from the feminist movement. The second and third claims we get are basically the same, and that's to say that it will be talked about in media and it will be talked about women explaining it. The first thing to note is, given the current context where the feminist movement is not accepted by everyone and there exists hostilities, it is unlikely why men are going to unambiguously endorse the views of women who will be perceived as a mouthpiece for what is often viewed as an extreme movement, that being the feminist movement. And it is so likely that they will not necessarily take that in a particularly good way. But the second thing to say is, and this goes directly to Third Feminist response about, well, it's men's only framework. Sure, but norms that have been internalized since childhood are with you for a very long time. That is why society moves very, very slowly. And at the point at which a woman is talking about a fundamental upheaval of your way of viewing the world and gender relations within it, I think that is just not enough analysis to suggest why men are going to fundamentally take that on board. But the third thing to say, as I've said, the third thing to say, and as we tell you, there are conservative media outlets as well. Like, let's not pretend that all media is going to unambiguously endorse this. You're likely going to see conservative media outlets go to the audience whose men are going to be particularly receive it badly and are going to heighten that and and make them angry and not turn them well. Because perhaps some progressive media outlets, perhaps the men watching them and progressive men, I think often progressive men view women as women and they're likely to support legislation. The biggest harm in this debate was people who were incredibly conservative or watched fringe media outlets where they were being told that like men and the way in which they act were at stake here. Like, that was the biggest harm, because those were the people who were likely to react incredibly poorly and treat women very badly and not want to fund and not want to support good support. The fourth thing to say, though, is by second affirmative characterization of male fragility and males crying, that is exactly why they're likely to take on board this talking in a bad way. Because if they are so fragile, then why are they going to then adopt this and fundamentally change them? That probably was never explained. That is why, even if that messaging was done in a politeful and respectful way, they were going to perceive it badly. But often this messaging was actively harmful and actively stoked the anger of people. Let's turn to the second question of men acting. I first want to deal with this issue that Third Affirmative ostensibly claims is debate winning, and that's just, well, more women are included. Firstly, the very reason that Third Affirmative gives, these people have zero political capital. These people are literally powerless. It is unclear why they're able to get the enormous change we're able to when we actually try and when we actually don't disenfranchise the men who are in power, which we would note in this context are generally conservative. Look at Australia, look at America. The governments are quite conservative of women's issues. This was the world in which this debate wanted to take place. Note, Affirmative set this debate up in countries like this. But the second thing to say, and as we tell you, is that it checks the perception of feminists, not women. That is a fundamental difference. Given that this was fundamentally a feminist movement, an active debate where the feminist movement was encouraging this, it didn't change men's views of women. It just changed their view of feminists. That was clearly not debate winning in any sense of the word. Secondly, I want to turn to the reasons Third gives for this biggest change, because I think this is where the importance in the debate lies. We hear a few things. Firstly, the first reason is just a concession that men won't change, and the response here is to say, yeah, and it will lead to further radicalization on their side at the point at which these men will not change. But the second thing to say is what I have already talked about, which is that left-wing elitist men, or inner city men will change their view. Firstly, how many of they are there? Come on, this is such a minority stakeholder, it's not even funny. But secondly, as I tell you, at the point at which they have watched these movies since childhood, it is unlikely that just a simple conversation is going to change that. Likely they are going to still not exactly get on board. But even if they do, their votes for legislation to support women stay the same. That was a symmetric benefit on both sides. These men weren't exactly the ones that we necessarily cared about. The third reason that Third Affirmative gives, which is Me Too movements, firstly, that was a fundamentally different thing. That is sexual assault in the workplace, where it's pretty obvious that is heinously bad. The fact that Me Too movement had such struggles to actually get change on an issue like that suggests how difficult it is to get men on board. Imagine trying to convince men that the problem is opening a door when convincing them that being sexually assaulted in the workplace was actually actually quite a difficult thing, and the Me Too movement still faces substantial opposition from media conservative groups that we have mentioned down the bench. So let's then turn to this idea of leading women on. The first thing to say is in instances where interactions actually went well and men were absolutely not trashed or actually respected them. These were the men who had traditional values who bought them a drink, but probably like weren't incredibly evil. Like that was probably a net benefit. I just point out like these interactions. But the second thing to say is women have ways to assess situations. And often that way of situation is to accept yes and then make an excuse about going to a bathroom, right? Like as a feminist movement who supported autonomy, it was particularly strange to me why you necessarily wanted to limit that and outrightly put them in safety, because often it was hard to judge. No opposition concedes it's often hard to judge men because they say, oh, you only find out halfway to the house. That is a complicit concession that is actually hard to judge how men will react, and you should probably err on the side of safety at the point at which women are dying. That was the imperative in this debate. That was a problem that they had to stand that they had to stand behind. The final thing to say is just the enormous lack of mechanisms for why men will change. All the reasons that opposition gives you, such as nice guys being a sense of entitlement, nice guys being toxic, nice guys having been male, being fragile, is all the reasons why they are not going to change. The reason is just this: messaging is good, therefore behavior change. That was such a lack of analysis to all the reasons we gave you that they would accept this message in a bad way and actively be disenfranchised from the feminist movement and never support it and never get change and never open up that movement, which, as we tell you, is the most important and valuable mechanism for the feminist movement. So proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Thank you everyone for the debate. I think you guys can leave the round.